It's a pleasure to be here this evening to discuss about the legitimate ways to migrate to Canada. Thank you so much, Mr. Gibbs, for that introduction. So today we have a lot to discuss with respect to coming to Canada. I know that, coming to Canada has been, a really hot topic of recent years. But my disclaimer this evening is that this presentation is only intended for information purposes only and is not to constitute providing legal advice or services. So if you were to want to seek legal advice or services, you would have to basically, enter into take the necessary steps forward to actually get advice on a personal level with respect to your particular questions. Now, today we're going to be looking at the different avenues to obtain status in Canada. So one of the most familiar ways would be entering Canada as a visitor, as we all know. In terms of obtaining status in Canada, individuals can study in Canada, individuals can work in Canada, individuals can apply under certain economic streams, and we have family sponsorship. When you have Canadian relatives or permanent residents in Canada and you want to join them in Canada. And then we also have the refugee program, which has been very popular in recent years as well. And then a miscellaneous category of humanitarian and compassionate considerations, which we're going to discuss, that we may not know a lot about, but we're going to basically talk about that this evening. Now, just a view of Canada's landscape with respect to immigration, because when we're talking about Canadian immigration, we always have to acknowledge that Canada is a big country. It's very big landscape-wise. We have 10 provinces and we have 3 territories. And the amazing thing about Canada and its landscape and immigration is that immigration is shared between the provinces and the federal, which means that persons could migrate to Canada on a federal level, which means they have the flexibility of moving anywhere in Canada that they please. And then we have Canadian immigration that is on the provincial level, where individuals are going to a particular designated province. So they're choosing a province of their choice beforehand, and they're specifically going to that province. So in Canada, persons migrate to the provinces, or sometimes they migrate to the territories. And regardless of wherever they're going, they would always have to basically apply to the Canadian immigration for the necessary status. Now, in terms of statuses, when we're talking about obtaining status in Canada, we have temporary statuses in Canada and we have permanent statuses. So the idea about temporary status is that you're coming to Canada for an authorized particular activity, or you're coming to Canada for a specified length of time. And then once you've completed your particular activity, you're going to leave Canada. When you're looking at gaining some kind of permanent status in Canada, you're looking at showing the government that you intend to settle in Canada permanently, which means you're going to make Canada your permanent home and you're going to stay for a long time. So individuals can gain status in Canada legitimately, either temporarily by applying for temporary status, or they could apply for permanent residence. And depending on your particular situation and your circumstance, individuals have the flexibility to choose whether they want to migrate temporarily or they want to migrate permanently. Now, in terms of temporary status, the first status that we're going to look at is visitors, which is the most common. A lot of persons visit Canada. Canada is a lovely place to visit. Now, in order for persons to visit Canada, they would require some kind of authorization to travel to Canada. Now, when we say authorization, usually it comes in 2 forms. So you either need a visitor visa or you need what we call an electronic travel authorization. Now, Barbadian nationals are exempt from the requirement of needing a visitor visa. So lucky for many Barbadians, you only need an electronic travel authorization, which is basically is usually attached to the passport. And we say it's an invisible document. It gives authorization in order to travel to Canada. So it kind of like lets Canada know that you're coming to Canada, and you answer what we call admissibility questions when you're applying for that ETA. It's around $7, and you could apply for it on the Canada's website, which is www.canada.ca. So it's usually very simple, a very simple document to get. In terms of the processing times, it's processed very quickly, so you could get it around 11 minutes after applying. And it's really simple compared to a visitor visa. So depending on a person's country of nationality, they would either require an electronic travel authorization or a full visitor visa, where they would have to pay $100 to immigration in order and actually submit the applicable forms and fill out the applicable application online in order to get that visitor visa. So again, Barbadian nationals are exempt from the requirement to get a visitor visa. They could qualify for the electronic travel authorization. But if a person's citizenship is from another country, they may want to seek information and advice or check on the IRCC website, www.canada.ca, to see if they would need a visitor visa and how they could travel to Canada on that visitor visa. Now, in terms of visitors, one of the most important things to note is that visitors are authorized to remain in Canada for 6 months, unless otherwise indicated by the port of entry officer. So the general rule is that they could stay for 6 months, but if the port of entry officer stamps their passport and say that they have to leave before that 6 months period, they have to abide by that particular authorized stay. So visitors would have that 6 months period, and sometimes persons decide to stay in Canada longer, and they could choose to extend their status. Now, there are some visas that persons could qualify for, but that visa is what we call like a dual or hybrid type of visa for parents and grandparents. And these are parents and grandparents of Canadian citizens or permanent residents that are residing in Canada. And these visas are really unique. So it's only under those circumstances that they allow these individuals to visit Canada for 2 years or sometimes 5 years at a time. Right now, since July 2022, it has been 5 years at a time. So parents and grandparents of Canadians and permanent residents can actually stay in Canada for 5 years at a time. Anyone else that is not in that parent and grandparent category would be subject to that 6 month rule. Now, as I said before, if individuals wish to stay in Canada longer, before their stay is up, they should apply for a visitor extension, which we also call a visitor record, that would allow them to stay in Canada for a longer period. Now, one of the most interesting things about staying in Canada longer and applying for a visitor extension is that the rule is that if a visitor applies for their extension before their status expires, they have what we call implied status or maintained status, which allows them to stay in Canada until the government renders a decision. So when the government renders a decision, then they would be able to, once the government renders that decision, then they're able to stay in Canada beyond that particular time. So they're able to stay on their implied status. And then once the decision is rendered, if the government were to give them another 3 months or another 6 months, then they're able to stay 3 months, or they're able to stay for that 6 months. Now, sometimes some individuals, they get to Canada, they have such a good time, and then they kind of forget about their status and how long they've been in Canada. And if you overstay your status, individuals can apply for what we call a restoration of their status, or temporary. They could apply for that restoration of their status within 90 days of losing their status, or they have the option to leave Canada. Now, we always usually advise persons to apply for the restoration, because once you have overstayed, it's almost as if, it looks as if the individual is not complying with their status. And, immigration, you would want that you are complying so that it does not jeopardize any future applications that you would have. So one of the rules that immigration would have in Canada is that you're really maintaining your status at all times. You're not overstaying, you're not breaking our rules, you're not circumventing our rules. And they want to see that you could abide. So once an individual overstays their status, it makes it a little bit more difficult when they're looking to come to Canada permanently, or even for the future, if they're coming to work or study. So it's always good for individuals to submit what we call that restoration in order to stay in Canada a little longer. Now, it's important to note that visitors are not permitted to work or study in Canada. With respect to studying, there is a clause that they could study a program that is for less than 6 months without needing a study permit. But generally, if they want to study a program that is longer than 6 months, they're looking at applying for a study permit. So visitors are not permitted to just come to Canada and work or study without any kind of authorization. And when we say authorization, we're talking about working a work permit or study permit. So an actual document that says you're authorized to work or you're authorized to study. So working without authorization in Canada can jeopardize any future or temporary permanent applications you have. So you want to make sure that you're always within your status and you're basically complying with whatever conditions is related to that status. So for example, if you're a visitor, you shouldn't be working or you shouldn't be studying unless you get that work permit or you get that study permit. So visitors are usually required to apply for work permits and study permits from outside Canada. So that is the normal way of applying. But we do acknowledge that sometimes from time to time, we have certain temporary policies that would allow visitors to apply for work permits from within Canada. Now, these temporary policies does not mean that the general rules have changed or the rules around working in Canada has changed. It's just to facilitate easier travel. It's just to facilitate and accommodate easier circumstances if the person is already in Canada and the employer has offered them a job instead of them having to travel outside Canada in order to initiate that work permit. They could apply directly from Canada. Sorry, give me 1 minute, guys. Yeah, so it's the same. So in terms of temporary policies, the temporary policies, they have a temporary policy right now that is actually in place for visitors to apply for a work permit within Canada. And this policy is supposed to be in place until February 2025. So I just want to make it clear that, in order for a visitor to apply for a work permit, usually the types of work permits that individuals would qualify for would be what we would call employer-specific work permits, which are work permits that are tied to a specific employer. So the idea is that visitors need to have what we call a valid job offer in order to come under this policy. So it's an assumption, right? And it's kind of like a myth that visitors can just come to Canada and they could work. They would need to have some kind of job offer in place through an employer. And when we're talking about job offers from employers, we're talking about employers submitting some kind of formal documentation to the government in order for these persons to get approval to work in Canada. So we're looking at, the employer really facilitating this process, offering that job, and then actually waiting on the government to say, well, yes, this person can work in Canada. So we're going to discuss about working a little later on. Now, the next status you can obtain in Canada legitimately would be studying. And the study program is a very interesting program, and it's a huge program in Canada. So many individuals usually use studying as a route to legitimately expand and further their studies in Canada, and also to, get their foot wet into the Canadian job market, and then, sometimes transitioning to permanent residence. So not only does Canada have great educational programs, but most post-secondary programs that individuals would study would actually lead to them being eligible for what we call open work permits for them to work in Canada after you study. So the study program kind of feeds into the work program, and then it later feeds into the permanent resident program. Now, what is also interesting about studying in Canada is that spouses are highly recognized in Canadian immigration, in Canadian immigration law. So in terms of your spouses, once individuals are looking to study in Canada, they can actually have their spouses accompany them. When we say spouses, we're talking about spouses and common law partners that would accompany them. And the spouses and common law partners are usually able to apply for a work permit to work while their spouse is studying. So it's a program that facilitates for not only the main applicants that are studying, but also the spouses and common law partners that would want to work in Canada. But there's a catch with respect to the spouses and common law partners. They would need to, the main applicants that are studying would need to study at a public institution, not a private institution. So we're going to discuss that a little later on as well. But one of the most important takeaways is that international students are able to transition into permanent residence, right? So they're usually able to, the system facilitates, the easy transition for them to have that study permit status and then go to workers and then transition to permanent residence. So this is a very popular way for persons to, come to Canada temporarily and then apply permanently to stay in Canada. Now, when you're looking to study in Canada, the first thing that you're going to do is choose a program and school. And the program and school that you're going to choose matters in the sense that you want the school to be a designated learning institution. So you want to make sure that you're cross-referencing the schools with the government's website, which is www.canada.ca. And you want to make sure that the schools that you're going to are designated under the Canadian government, and that you can, in terms of they're fitting within your immigration plan. So you want to make sure that the schools are fitting your academic goals in terms of what you want to study. And then also that the schools are fitting your immigration goals. So as I said before, not all schools would be eligible for individuals to get that work permit after. You would need to be going to a public institution. And it also matters for your spouse's work permits as well. So if you go to a private institution, your spouses are not able to get the work permit. But if you go to a public institution, the spouses can apply for that work permit. So when we're looking at post-secondary schools in Canada, you're looking at colleges, you're looking at universities, you're looking at private career colleges. You want to be wary of those. You're looking at vocational and technical schools. And all of these schools and institutions have their own sets of rules on how to apply in terms of what kind of requirements they're looking for, what kind of grades they're looking for. So you would want to have a conversation with respect to, in terms of these schools, to know if the program is the right fit for you and if it's fitting your immigration goals. So if you know you want to work after you study, you should be going to a public institution. Once again, if you want your spouse to join you in Canada to work in Canada, you would want to make sure that you're going to a public institution. Now, in terms of applying for the study permit, so the first thing you would want to do is you want to make sure that you're searching and you're applying for that program of interest, and then you receive your letter of acceptance from that institution. So you apply, you receive that letter of acceptance, which is material in the application, as we would say, in the sense that, without the letter of acceptance, there's no granting of the study permit. You have to show that letter of acceptance, and then you have to source funding for tuition and your travel and your maintenance. So one of the main reservations about studying in Canada is that, the costs, right? That is expensive. But, it is expensive. But I would say that, persons have been able to reap the benefits with respect to meeting their immigration goals and with respect to getting their feet into, working and living in Canada, because as we start to discuss about the permanent resident programs and the work permit programs later, you'll see that working in Canada sometimes may not be, if you just want to work right off the bat, it may not be feasible because the work permit programs are really tight in a sense. There are a lot of rules, there are a lot of requirements, there are a lot of standards to meet, and it's very few opportunities without the involvement of an employer, right? So usually most of the work permits are tied to an employer, but once you're a student and you're studying and you're able to apply for that work permit after, you're able to get an open work permit, which means you're not tied to a specific employer. You can move anywhere in Canada to any of the 10 provinces or even territories and work there and settle there if you want. So in terms of tuition and funding, you want to make sure that you're saving. You want to make sure that you're, looking for the necessary financial backing in order to fund your tuition. And I do think that you reap the benefits, right? You want to apply for the study permit from directly on immigration website, or you want to seek professional help with respect to getting that study permit. And once you receive that approval and you get what we call a letter of introduction from immigration, you basically travel to Canada with if you have a visa, or if you're exempt from a visa like Barbadian nationals, you get your ETA, you travel to Canada, and then once you arrive at the port of entry, you get your study permit, and then you're able to be authorized to study. Okay. Now, there are a lot of popular post-secondary institutions, so I just have a few here in terms of the ones in Ontario, Toronto, because that's where I am. But you don't have to limit yourself. There are different schools all over Canada. All 10 provinces, have public institutions where individuals could apply. And like I said, usually studying in Canada is one of the best ways. It has been for many years one of the best ways, and it remains one of the best ways and easiest ways to migrate to Canada, because they want to have immigrants, they want to have workers. And we've seen time and time again, the government actually looking out for international students, making sure that they're able to work, making sure that, I do believe that if there's any flexibility given to anyone in the immigration system, it would be international students. So we're even seeing that now with respect to students and their ability to work. So there's some needs to know with respect to persons studying in Canada. Now, for persons that are studying post-secondary programs, they can work for up to 20 hours per week during their academic sessions, and they could work full-time during their regular schedule breaks. So schedule breaks mean summer breaks, winter breaks. They could usually work during those breaks, and they can work full-time when they apply for the post-graduation work permit, and they're basically waiting for the decision. Now, with students, like I said before, the government has a soft spot for students. So they usually give students a lot of leeway. Right now, we're seeing a lot of policies come out. And one of the main policies that we looked at, that we actually see, is that international students that applied for their study permits before October 7th, 2022, they could actually work full-time. So the government is looking for them to, fill job shortages in Canada. And, most of the time when the government is looking for these skilled laborers, they're not looking outside, right? Because they have their rules with respect to persons outside. They're very, territorial, they have a lot of red tape. But if they're looking to fill labor shortages, they're going to look to the international students first. So there is that policy in place where international students can work full-time if they applied for their study permit before October 7th, 2022. Everybody else that would apply after, they would have to work. They could work 20 hours per week, but not full-time. But they could still work full-time during their regular scheduled breaks, which would be winter breaks, which would be summer breaks. Now, students, like I said, once they're done studying, they could apply for what we call an open work permit. This is a special type of work permit that is called a post-graduation work permit. This work permit allows them to work for any employer all over Canada, gain the necessary work experience for permanent residents, which would be at least 1 year of Canadian work experience in a professional type job. And once they get that 1 year of work experience, then they could apply for permanent residence under one of the applicable programs, either in the provinces or federally. And students can also extend and restore their status in the event that they have lost their status or they have overstayed. And they could also extend their status if they want to further their studies, if they want to study additionally, right? So depending on the work permit that they get is heavily dependent on the program that they study and the length of that program. So if they study a program that is less than 2 years, they usually get the work permit for the length of time that they studied. And if they study a program that is 2 years or more, they get the work permit for 3 years. So they reap that benefit. And in terms of actually obtaining permanent residence, they're able to work, they at least work for 1 year, get Canadian work experience for 1 year in a professional type job, meaning that the job has to be a certain level, and that should be enough for them to apply in order to get permanent residence. Now, Mr. Gibbs or Consul General, I want to pause here. Are there any questions at this time?
No questions as yet. You can continue.
Okay, thank you. Okay. Now, in terms of working in Canada, now I think a lot of people are particularly excited about working in Canada and understanding how you could work in Canada. Now, persons wishing to work in Canada require some type of work authorization, unless they're exempt from the requirements of needing a work permit. So there are some people that we recognize that, you know, their jobs are so significant in Canada, they bring such a benefit. Sometimes they're not entering into the labor market, they're not competing with any Canadians or permanent residents, because that is how we define work. We define work by if you're competing with Canadians for particular jobs, if you're being paid a wage. And there's some people that are naturally exempt from needing a work permit. So we have like athletes and coaches, we have like crew members, we have like religious leaders, public speakers, performing artists. When we look at the nature of these type jobs, you know, persons are usually not entering into the labor market. They're coming to Canada to facilitate a particular purpose. And once that purpose is done, they're leaving without causing any upheaval or any kind of issues on the labor market. So there's some persons that are exempt from needing a work permit, but in most cases, you are going to need a work permit in order to work in Canada. Now, in terms of obtaining a work permit, there are two general types of work permits. So you have the open work permit, which could be restricted or unrestricted. We'll talk about that later. And then you have the employer-specific work permits, which usually come with an LMIA, which is called a labor market impact assessment, or they could be labor market impact assessment exempt. So generally, what I want everyone to take away from this presentation is that generally, you are going to need an employer-specific work permit unless you're coming under a program, like, for example, the students that then apply for work permits and their work permit is open. I would say that unless you're connected to Canada in some type way, like you're already here, or your spouse is already here, or your family member has submitted some kind of permanent resident application, if you don't fit those type of prescribed unique situations where you're already tied and connected to Canada, you will more than likely need an employer-specific work permit, which means that you're going to need a valid job offer from an eligible Canadian employer in order to be granted that work permit. So most work permits come with the full cooperation of the employer. So when you're looking to work in Canada, it begins with having an open conversation with the employer in terms of if they're going to be able to support and facilitate the work permit process by way of applying for a labor market impact assessment or applying for a particular work permit that is exempt from a labor market impact assessment. Okay, so open work permits, allow persons to work for any employer, but they have some general law restrictions. Like, for example, persons can't work for non-compliant employers that had a brush with the law, or employers who offer striptease or erotic dances, escort services, erotic massages. Those restrictions are general, so individuals are not allowed to be in that line of work. In terms of the employer-specific work permit, as I was saying, the work permit is going to be limited to that particular employer. So your work permit is going to have the name of the employer that you're going to work for, is going to have the duration of time that you're expected to work, which may match your job contract, and then it may have the location where you're permitted to work. So employer-specific work permits require the full cooperation of employers. Now, in terms of the labor market impact assessment and what is seen as a valid job offer, so sometimes the language and the verbiage on the immigration website is a little bit confusing. They said you would need a job offer. And if you tell any individual about a job offer, they would take that as having a conversation with an employer, and the employer saying, well, yes, I would like to hire you. I could write you a letter and you could give it to to immigration, and then we could hire you. But it's really not that simple. When we're talking about a valid job offer, we're talking about a job offer that is supported by a labor market impact assessment. So this type process, which is the labor market impact assessment, we also call it an LMIA, is a process that in which the employer fully has to undergo this process first in order for you to apply for any type of work permit. So essentially, the LMIA involves the employer advertising that position all over Canada. So they have to advertise the position all over Canada, whatever position they want to offer you. And they have to prove to the Canadian government that there are no Canadians or permanent residents that are fit to fill that job. So they're going to prove that there are no Canadians or permanent residents that have the necessary skills and expertise to do that job. And they can't hire anybody in Canada, they could only hire you. So the test of the labor market impact assessments are really high, in the sense that sometimes it is an expensive process and the employers may not be fully open to actually being involved in that particular process. So you want to make sure that if you're having a conversation with the employer with respect to a job offer, that they're fully aware of the labor market impact assessment and they're willing to go that extra mile in terms of applying for that and getting that confirmation from the Canadian government in order for you to then apply for your work permit. Without that labor market impact assessment, your job offer is basically not valid. So it means that it would be considered under the table. It wouldn't be good for immigration purposes. You wouldn't be able to be granted a work permit. So when you apply for a work permit just without any kind of LMIA, or if you're not LMIA exempt, you're looking at getting a refusal, right? Like usually the Canadian government is going to refuse it and they're going to say that, your job offer is not supported by an LMIA and you need to have an LMIA. So a lot of employers in Canada know this. They know of the LMIA. You want to be wary, you want to be careful. They know of the expenses with respect to the LMIA. One thing about the LMIA is that if an individual is looking to migrate to Canada permanently and they're looking to apply under certain programs like Express Entry, the employers they're waived. The processing fees for the LMIA is waived. So the employer does not have to submit any processing fees for the LMIA to have that LMIA process, but they still have to apply for that LMIA. So some employers get excited once individuals are applying for permanent residence. And that's why sometimes in the field we say it's easier to get permanent residence than to probably apply for a work permit, because employers know that they don't have to pay that processing fee for the LMIA. They get excited and they're more looking to support your paperwork in that way. Now, generally, with the LMIA process, it takes a while. LMIAs typically take around 3 months. They could take up to 4 months to be processed. Sometimes they could be processed very quickly, but depending on the government and their backlogs and their strikes and so on, it could be processed. It could take a while to be processed. But once that LMIA is processed and you apply for your work permit, the work permit is ultimately tied to that employer. So working for another employer while you're on that work permit would be a violation, okay? So you want to make sure that in terms of flexibility for individuals that want to be flexible, they could apply for the open work permit. But like I said, there are only prescribed circumstances under which you could be able to apply for open work permit. Like if you're an international student and then you apply for the open work permit after, or if you're a spouse, or if you're somebody that applied for permanent residence in Canada, and the act and the rules and so on facilitates your process of applying for that open work permit. Now, there are some jobs in Canada that are LMIA exempt, so they don't need an LMIA, but it doesn't mean that it's any easier to get a work permit. They might not need an LMIA, but the employers still have to formally submit a job offer to immigration in order for that to be approved. So basically, the system is safeguarded in a way to ensure that persons that are already in Canada, whether they're permanent resident or Canadians, have the first picking with respect to these jobs, rather than the employer just handing a job to someone outside Canada or somebody that is not a Canadian or permanent resident in Canada. So most of the jobs that are LMIA exempt, they are that way because they provide some kind of significant benefit to Canada, and they support Canada's broader economic and cultural benefits. So for example, high-level executives that are moving from one company to the next, so for example, they're moving from a particular company, a head office of a company, and they're moving to some kind of subsidiary in Canada or affiliate or some kind of branch, like in those type situations, you would not need an LMIA. The employer would not need an LMIA. And also, like, for example, religious workers, sometimes, they don't need an LMIA because the job that they're doing in Canada is seen to have significant benefit. So if you are working for a company that is, that has a Canadian affiliate, or they have a Canadian branch or subsidiary, you would want to have a conversation with respect to some kind of transfer from that company to the next. But in terms of those type transfers, even though you don't need an LMIA, those transfers are reserved for persons that hold executive positions. They're reserved for persons that hold managerial positions, and also persons that have what we call unique specialized knowledge. So they have a unique specialized knowledge, and is only under those 3 prescribed circumstances that you can transfer from one company to the next without having that LMIA. But ultimately, the norm is to get that LMIA and then apply for the work permit, okay? So in terms of the process of applying for the work permit, you want to make sure that the Canadian employers are on board, they apply for that LMIA, you have that confirmation, okay? So you receive that job offer, you receive that LMIA, the LMIA application is approved, you use that LMIA to apply for the work permit online, and then you get what we call a letter of approval, or the introduction letter. And if you are from a country like Barbados that is exempt from needing a visitor visa, you're then able to travel to Canada on your ETA, or if you need a visitor visa, they give you a visa automatically, you travel to Canada, and then you are able to get your work permit at the port of entry, where the employers, the CBS, which is the Canada Border Services Agency at the port of entry, are able to issue you your work permit for you to begin your working in Canada. Now, in terms of the searching for jobs in Canada, you want to make sure that you're using legitimate sites to search for jobs in Canada. Our main site, which is the site that, employers mandatorily have to apply on, would be Job Bank. So anytime an employer is trying to do an LMIA, or they're trying to seek foreign nationals, the government makes it mandatory that they apply under Job Bank, which is our national job searching site. And under this site, as a job seeker, you could create an account on Job Bank, which would allow you to be able to see employers. Job Bank has a job match tool where it could, you put your information, it asks you a questionnaire, you put in your skills, your experience, your education, and it kind of prompts, the jobs that match your skills and education. So this is free to use, okay, and is linked to Canada's government websites. And sometimes employers are forced to be transparent on Job Bank. So on Job Bank, the government actually gives them the opportunity to actually state if they're interested in hiring somebody from the outside or not. So when you're searching Job Bank, you may see, some employers say flat out, they require somebody that already has work authorization in Canada, or they require somebody that already is a Canadian or already is a permanent resident. That would mean that the employer is not interested in submitting an LMIA. And then for some employers, they wouldn't have such restrictions, which means that they may be open to applying for an LMIA for the individual. And then we have other sites like Indeed, which is a popular one, which is also free to use. And this particular site, it pulls careers from other sites and classified listings from other sites. So Indeed, usually you would see repeat jobs posted on Job Bank and also posted on Indeed, but you could use those to apply for jobs. We have Workopolis, which is another one that is free, Workopolis is a really good Canadian platform, and it offers services in French and English. And then you have Monster Canada, which is free to use, and they have like video job ads, and they also can assess your resume to make sure that it's on Canadian standards. And you have eJobO, which is another job site that is really interesting as well. Now, in terms of applying for the work permit, most of the work permits are applied automatically. You apply for them online, and you have to submit all the necessary documents, immigration forms, your passport. You really need the employer's information. So you need necessary documents like your contract, the job offer from the employer, the LMIA number. If it's LMIA exempt, the government is still going to give a number to make sure that that particular job offer is vetted and approved by the Canadian government. You could use your resume and any kind of evidence that you want to show to support that you could do the job. So the thing about applying for a work permit is that even if you apply, even if the employer applies on your behalf for that LMIA, or they apply to the government because the position is LMIA exempt, the work permit, if there's anything amiss with your paperwork, the work permit could still be refused. So when you're applying for the work permit, you need to make sure that you have enough evidence to show that you meet the requirements for the job. So because the immigration officers that are actually processing the work permit application, they're a little bit more picky than the LMIA when you're applying for the LMIA. For the LMIA, they're just going to look at the job as it relates to the labor market in Canada. But for the work permit, is going to be based on you and your capabilities to do that job. And they really want to see that you have the necessary skills, education, and language requirements to fulfill that job. So you want to make sure that the work permit applications are very thorough. And, if necessary, you should, make sure that if you're doing it yourself, you should make sure that you're very thorough. And if not, you should be seeking some kind of professional help with respect to preparing those type applications. Now, in terms of, as I was talking about open work permit, so, there's a lot of, in terms of applying to Canada, like I said, employer-specific work permits are the main type work permits. And I see a hand is up, yes.
The person would have to type the question and then we will repeat it to you because no one is allowed to unmute their mics at this time. But the one question which has been typed relates to the length of time it will take to process the study permits. Okay,
the length of time. In terms of study permits, it varies. So they say that if you're looking to study in Canada, you should be applying for your study permit within 6 months, within the 6 months that you are looking to study. However, I've seen immigration process study permits very quickly, right? So they take into consideration when the person is going to begin their studies. So I would say, like, if somebody's going to start to study in September, like if they're going to study for the fall, they should make sure that they're applying for their study permit around, like, they could apply for it from as early as May, June, right? Sometimes some people are very last minute because of funding and so on, and they happen to apply like the month before, and I still see them get approved. So that varies, right? Some people apply at the very last minute and they get approved, and some people obviously apply earlier on and then they're able to get approved as well. So it all varies. Okay. Was there another question?
That was the only one that was typed.
Okay, thank you. Great. So in terms of, like, I was speaking a lot about employer-specific work permits. And in terms of, and I keep mentioning that there are only certain prescribed circumstances under which individuals could apply for open work permits. So sometimes some people would, contact professionals and say, oh, how can I qualify for open work permit? And we would usually say that there are only prescribed circumstances under which you could do so. So we have, like I said, international students, usually that is like the easiest way. When they're completed their studies, they're able to get the post-graduation work permit. You have situations where students sometimes can no longer support their studies. So they could no longer finance their studies. So there is a type of work permit that they could apply for, which is based on their own merits. It's called a destitute work permit. But this work permit is very, what we call discretionary. So I think it's a very hard work permit to get. You would have to make sure that you have to prove to immigration that the reason why you're applying for this work permit is because you really can't support your studies, and the reason why you're not able to is because of a situation that is beyond your control. So just to put that in context, like, for example, a student that their home country has been affected by war and there's a banking collapse, then those type students will be considered destitute students. They're not able to support their studies, and that is considered a situation which is beyond their control. Now, when persons are looking to study in Canada, the financial part of the application is really important. So immigration wants to see that they could support themselves when they study. And therefore, if you're in Canada, you find yourself not being able to support your studies, it may not be a good look for immigration, because the whole point is that you're able to pay your way and you're able to support yourself. So destitute students and applying for an open work permit under that situation, that is not just another category that you could potentially abuse. Another type of open work permit that you could get in Canada, they do acknowledge that sometimes some employers could be abusive. So sometimes when workers are on what we call employer-specific work permits, sometimes the employers may, not match the job offer in terms of what was agreed. Sometimes a lot of workers face, different types of psychological abuse, financial abuse, sometimes physical abuse. In those types of prescribed circumstances, they could apply for what we call an open work permit, but they have to prove that they were abused. So they have to make sure that they have the necessary documentation to show immigration that they're not just applying for that open work permit, but it's because of that situation that they're abused, and then ultimately they're not able to work for any other employer because their work permit is tied to that employer. And in that type situation, they can apply for an open work permit. Now, if individuals have applied for permanent residence in Canada, in that they have submitted a permanent resident application in Canada, they have received an acknowledgement that that application was received by immigration, under those circumstances, they could apply for permanent residence in Canada. And then if there are dependent family members of someone who applied for permanent residence, those persons could also come under the fold and actually get an open work permit as well. And as I said, if you are a spouse or common law partner of a person that is studying in Canada or a person that is working in Canada, you could apply for open work permit. Or if you're a spouse or common law partner of a person that applied for some kind of pilot program in Canada, you could also qualify for open work permit. Now, if you're a refugee claimant, protected person, or a family member of a refugee or protected person, you could qualify for a work permit. And then we have some type of open work permits for like temporary resident permit holders. So people that would have come to Canada because they're inadmissible. Like, so for example, they're medically inadmissible. They come to Canada for some kind of surgery or something like that. They come to Canada, they got what we call a temporary resident permit, which is a special permit. They too can apply for an open work permit. And if they're a young worker and participating in special programs, like international programs prescribed in our laws, then you could also apply for work permit. So it's only these specified cases where you could apply for open work permit, and ultimately everybody else that is coming outside of that would need to get an employer specific work permit, which means they would need the involvement of the employer in order to get that work permit. Now, in terms of when you're looking for jobs in Canada, you want to make sure that you're not looking in the metropolitan areas only. So the metropolitan areas, I mean the big cities like Montreal, Toronto, Vancouver. You want to look in the rural areas because sometimes those are the areas that actually really want persons. So when you see different types of ads in Canada or from Canada where they're saying that Canada needs workers and they need persons to fill job shortages, usually it's the places that are rural and, I don't want to say remote, but those rural areas. Sometimes there's low competition. There are different types of programs that help individuals transition to permanent residence. The government is very aware that those persons need people. And if you're going to get a work permit relatively easy, usually an employer over there might be a little bit more compliant. They might be a little bit more easygoing or just really wanting workers, and it would be more they would be more into applying for an LMIA for that worker. Now, you want to also make sure that you're enlisting, necessary help if necessary in terms of your job search. So you want to make sure, you could contact like headhunters, recruitment agencies, career counsels, counselors, immigration consultants, lawyers. You want to make sure that you are doing your research, your due diligence. So if you were to receive a post on your phone or you were to see something on the internet, you want to make sure you're cross-referencing that with the government's website to make sure that it is something that is coming from the government and is not some scam that they're running, or is not some kind of person that is involved in some kind of program that is, you know, a blacklisted type of program. And one thing that individuals need to know is that in this whole entire process of applying for an LMIA or not needing an LMIA, applying for open work permit, whenever you're looking for jobs in Canada, they're not allowed to charge you for looking for a job for you, right? So they're not allowed to collect a fee from you directly or indirectly, you know, in order to help you find a job, right? You're not supposed to pay companies in order to work. The companies pay you. And if you're using headhunters, you're using recruitment agencies, the companies actually pay those recruitment agencies and pay those headhunters, but you don't pay anyone, right? You would pay someone if you want assistance with the immigration process in terms of filing the forms and submitting your applications to immigration. But in terms of looking for jobs, and in terms of actually, you know, finding that job and putting in the groundwork, you know, they're really not allowed to charge you. They're really not allowed to collect a fee from you. Okay. You want to make sure that you're applying for your jobs with a Canadian style resume. So you're customizing your resume and cover letter for every single job that you're applying for. And you're looking for the research, you're researching the in-demand occupations in Canada. So there's some occupations in Canada that would be in demand. Like, for example, we're big on health. We have a socialist healthcare system, which means that they're always in need of nurses. They're always in need of like doctors. And again, sometimes some of these jobs are LMIA exempt, but you're still going to need the cooperation of an employer. So even if you were to be in a demand occupation, like a trade or something, you still want to have that conversation with the employer in order to see if they could do the necessary paperwork in order for you to work in Canada. You want to actively stay on your job search, and you want to look for new immigration programs, and you want to be aware of any kind of immigration scams. So like I said, you're cross-referencing your information with the government's website, which is www.canada.ca. And if the information is not on the government's website, more than likely it is not legit. So when you search immigration, you're going to see a lot of blogs and a lot of different articles and so on. You want to make sure that you're getting your information directly from the source, which would be the Canadian immigration website. Okay. Now, in terms of permanent resident status in Canada, so we talked about the temporary and temporarily moving to Canada. And like I said, sometimes when you're coming to Canada temporarily, students and workers, you transition to permanent residence, or sometimes some individuals can apply for permanent residence in Canada directly from outside Canada without having to do the temporary part of coming here temporarily. Now, just because you can just come to Canada as a permanent resident, it doesn't necessarily make it an easy feat. When you're looking to come to Canada permanently, one of the first programs, you know, that you're going to see would be under the economic streams. So applying to permanently reside in Canada under any kind of economic program usually requires an individual to show that they could be economically established in Canada. What we talk about economic establishment varies depending on the type of program that you're applying for. But mostly if you're applying under the biggest immigration programs, they're going to look at your language. So it's going to be required that you do some type of language test, even though you're coming from an English speaking country, even though you would have been educated in English all your life, they still want you to do a language test for competitive reasons. So a lot of these programs are programs where they're not necessarily lotteries, but they're programs that are based on competitiveness, and they rank candidates against each other. So the more competitive you are, the more higher they usually assign a point score, and the higher your points, the more competitive you are. So in terms of the language, like the higher your language scores, the better it is for you, right? And if you're a person that you speak in Canada, we're bilingual. We speak English and we speak French. So if you speak both languages, that's even better for you. They look at your age. So they do have a bias with respect to persons that are younger in age. So you would find that, it's not impossible for a person that is older in age, like a mature person, to come to Canada. But they do they do, like for in terms of programs that they offer points, they do give more points to individuals that are younger. So any person that is between the ages of say 25 and around 37 would get more points, you know, than an individual in their 50s, an individual in their 50s, or individual in their 60s. So age does matter. It is important that if you're looking to come to Canada, you're doing it when you're younger rather than later. But if you're coming as a mature person, is not impossible, but it's just a little bit more, you know, tedious in terms of getting your paperwork together. So I see that there's a question.
Yeah, the question is, why is it that the CELPIT test expires? That's question one. Question two, I am a registered medical laboratory technologist in Barbados. Would I need to do a CSMLS test as well as practice in Canada? Those are the first two questions. I have to go through off.
So the first question, which is the CELPIP question, in terms of the person asks why the CELPIP expires.
Yes.
Okay, so the CELPIP, so all the language test expires, like they expire within 2 years, right? There's no reasoning as to why. That is just the time limit that they have on it. Like it's 2 years. And if you apply when that 2 years is passed, you know, that test is null and void, you can't use it. They never give an explanation as to why. It's just one of those things that they have that timeline on. With respect to the other question, I can't answer that. It's too specific, okay? That would require a little bit more research with respect to the person's qualifications and the specific medical program that they're coming under, okay? So for the first question, again, with respect to the CELPIP, all the tests, the CELPIP and the IELTS test, they expire within 2 years, okay? And that is just the way it is. Usually for immigration documents, everything has a particular expiry. Nothing is in place that you could use for like forever, right? Everything has a particular time limit that you could use it, okay? Are there any other questions, or was that the only one?
Yeah, two others. Someone indicated that when they arrived in Canada, their passport was not stamped. So they just wanted confirmation as to when is their time to return to Barbados, I presume. And the second one is an international student in Canada is applying for a permanent residency. Can the student apply here? I am assuming what's here in Canada.
Okay. So for the first question, to confirm that about the visitor, so if they came in and their passport isn't stamped, they have 6 months. So 6 months from the day they enter, they have 6 months to stay. And with the international student, they want to know if they could apply for permanent residence. Sorry, the second question was clear.
Permanent residency, yes.
If the international student is qualifying under any of the programs that we're discussing, then yes. So there's nothing stopping. So how for immigration, how it works is that temporary is temporary and permanent is permanent. So even if you might be a student and you may qualify for immigration program, you could go ahead and apply for permanent residence, even though you're a student. But what will happen is that everything you apply for overrides what your status was before. So when that person becomes a permanent resident, then the studying would be null and void, right? The same as if they're working. Another thing to note is that with persons coming to Canada, you know, as a family unit with a spouse, and then with a spouse that is studying, and then the other spouse is working, the other spouse that is working, if they qualify for permanent residence at that time, they could also apply for permanent residence and add the person that is studying on that application as well. So there's nothing stopping anyone that is here temporarily to apply for permanent residence if they're eligible for the programs. Okay, so as I was saying, when you're looking to come to Canada under the economic stream, the language matters, the age matters. They do look at your foreign work experience. So having a foreign work experience at a high level, which is like professional work. So when we're talking about professional jobs, we're talking about jobs that you would need some kind of post-secondary education in order to obtain and maintain those jobs. So that foreign work experience is recognized, as well as Canadian work experience. So Canadian work experience is valued higher and it makes an individual more competitive. So if a person has foreign work experience and they have Canadian work experience by way of working on a work permit in Canada already, that makes them even more competitive for permanent residence. And then their education, okay? So their education matters. So if you did your studies in Canada, that is looked at, but also if you did your studies outside Canada, like if you went to, for example, UE or you went to BCC, is also recognized. But individuals have to show that their education is on a Canadian standard. So they will have to apply for something that is called an educational credential assessment, which shows that your education is on a Canadian standard. So in my experience, most persons from UE, most persons from BCC going, studying throughout the Caribbean, they have no issues having their education recognized on a Canadian standard. Usually a master's would be equivalent to a master's, a bachelor's would be equivalent to a bachelor's here in Canada. Now, your adaptability, they also look at your adaptability. So for example, if you have a spouse here in Canada that's studying, if you have family members in Canada, family members, that are able to, like, for example, siblings, or if you have, aunts or grandparents, they look at that. If you have a arranged employment, if you have a job offer in Canada, they do look at that. So these are the types of factors that make you a little bit more eligible or make you eligible under most of the economic programs. Now, it's important to note that each economic program has its own separate eligibility criteria and the requirements that applicants have to meet. So some of the programs are express entry, which is the largest and the most popular. So we would have covered that in previous seminars. So I think that information is available online with respect to our seminars that we did previously on express entry. It is the largest and most popular in terms of applying. So individuals apply based on their foreign work experience. They apply based on their Canadian work experience, or they apply based on, persons that are in the trades. So for example, welders, carpenters, plumbers, they could also come under express entry as well. Now, we also have the provincial nominee programs, which is also a pathway to apply for permanent residence. So Canada has 10 provinces, and like I said, we have 3 territories, and each province has its own needs, and all the provinces have their own individual immigration website. So there are 10 provinces, and we also have our Canadian immigration website for federal programs, but then persons could migrate to Canada on a provincial level. Under the provincial programs, all the provinces have their websites, and the programs are different, right? So there are programs in the provinces, and then there are programs federally. Now, one of the things to note is that, most of the provincial programs are suited for the needs of the province. So the provinces like to, open to people that are there already, right? So sometimes if you are looking to come to Canada, you're looking to migrate, you might want to look into the provinces and their programs to see, like, for example, which province has like good programs for nurses, right? Like, for example, Nova Scotia is known to be big on the healthcare, and a lot of physicians and nurses and so on, go to Nova Scotia. Like, they have a demand for nurses and so on in Nova Scotia. British Columbia could have their demand for other things. Ontario could have their demand for other things, but all provinces have their programs. So sometimes when you're looking to migrate to Canada, it would help to narrow your research to a specific province to see what programs they have and to see what you need to do to be eligible for those programs. Now, we also have business programs. So Canada does recognize that persons may want to come to Canada to start up businesses. And these programs, the federal business programs, we have 2. One is called self-employed persons, and the other one is called startup visa. Now, from a business angle, when they look at economic establishment in Canada, is a little different to a worker. So if you're going to show that you're economically established as a worker, it means that you have the appropriate language, you have the appropriate education, you have the appropriate work experience. Now, for business, it's all about creating a business that is going to bring significant benefit to Canada and profit. So it's about showing immigration that you could create a business in order to hire Canadians. So they're looking at having a lot of capital, and they're looking at having transferable skills where Canadians could benefit. So in terms of the self-employed category, it's a very unique category, and it's for I would say it's exemplary in the sense that it's for persons that are looking to be self-employed in cultural activities or athletics. they're limited to those two streams. So cultural activities, you're looking at like music teachers, you're looking at like persons that are involved in like museums, curators, any persons that are involved in culture, right? Even musicians, right? Persons that are looking to create a business. And in creating a business and hiring Canadians, they're also looking to exchange they're looking to exchange their skills and expertise. So for self-employed persons, the reason why we would say is exemplary is that they're looking for persons that are renowned, and they're looking for persons that are well known. So you have to usually show that you have been competing or you're known on an international level or regional level. And you know, that goes for athletics and for cultural activities. And then we have what we call a startup visa program, which is really interesting. In terms of startup visa, it recognizes that persons might want to, you know, start up a particular business in Canada. Now, the startup visa program is an immigration program, but it stems into business and investors. So in this program, is mandatory that individuals get a commitment from what we call an angel investor or venture capitalist. So the program is very investor-like, and individuals can't just apply for this program. They would have to get this particular, their business idea would have to either enter into what we call a business incubator program, or their business idea would have to, they would have to actually pitch this idea to investors and actually get investors on board that would want to invest in that idea. And they could then apply for that startup visa. And that visa is a permanent resident visa, and persons, you can have more than one applicant on that visa. So I think up to 5 people could apply. So they could join together, they could apply, and they would have to show that they have, in terms of the startup visa, they would have to show that they're going to have the controlling interest in the company, right? As well as securing a Canadian investor in order to invest in their business idea. So that is something that you can also look at if you're interested in business and you have an innovative idea and you want to bring it to Canada. That is open for individuals as well. We have the Atlantic Immigration Program, which is another way to gain permanent status in Canada. That program is specific to the Atlantic provinces in Canada. So we have provinces like New Brunswick, we have Nova Scotia, we have Prince Edward Islands and Newfoundland and Labrador, which are our Atlantic provinces. And this program is employer driven. So it means that you have to get an employer on board with respect to offering you a job in one of those provinces. And the program is a dual program. So you're able to apply for your work permit and you're able to apply for permanent residence at the same time. And you're able to bring your families, but you must be settling in the Atlantic region in Canada. And the job that you're getting, the employer has to be endorsed by the government. So this program is really popular. A lot of people are able to come under this program as well. Now we have the rural and northern immigration pilot, which is for rural and northern areas. So a lot of areas in Ontario. So we have like areas in Thunder Bay. We have areas in northern Ontario that, you know, would need persons, and also in Manitoba that would need persons to work. And again, this program goes by the community. So you need to get a community sponsorship. So you need to have like a business that is in the community to actually offer a job offer. So as you can see, everything is centered to the employers. The government wants to make sure that the employers are happy and that, you know, they're able to access persons first. Now we have what we call the agri-food pilot for persons that are working in the food production industries. But again, this particular pilot is centered around having a job offer. So you're looking at approaching like companies, factories, especially if you have experience in the agri-food business. So if you have experience working in food production, that is also interested as well. Yes, there's a question.
Yes, the question relates to the length of time one would require to study in order to qualify for the immigration program. That's one question. Another But I'll let you answer that and then read the other one to you.
Okay, sure. In terms of the length of time that you're studying, in terms of studying to apply for the work permit, the length of studies, you want to study a program that is 8 months or more. I would say go for a program that is at least 1 year. And in terms of if you study a program that is 2 years or more, you get the work permit for 3 years. If you study a program that is less than that, you get the work permit for the length of time. But to qualify for permanent residence, most permanent residence programs require you to have at least 1 year of work experience. So the length of studies have to do with your work permit that you're going to get, and then your work permit leads into working. And for working, you need at least 1 year of Canadian work experience.
All right. This person indicates that they saw an advertisement which indicated that when you travel to Canada on an ETA, then you had received a valid job offer that you can then apply for a work visa whilst here in Canada, and you won't have to return.
That is true. But the thing there is the valid job offer, which means an LMIA, or it means an LMIA position, an LMIA exempt position, which is coming from the employer that has been vetted by the government. So yes, that is true.
Okay, the next is what documentation is required in order to prove a common law relationship?
So common law is defined as living together in Canada for 1 year. So in terms of the documentation, you're looking at documentation to show that you've been living together for 1 year. So lease agreements, documents where you have shared documents that shows that you share the address, driver's licenses. That question is really broad. There's a number of documents that you show, but ultimately they want to know that you've been living together for at least 1 year, and you can prove that. Right, so lease agreement is the strongest. Some people would use insurance documents to show that, you know, one person is the other person's beneficiary. There's a statutory declaration form that you submit. But ultimately, in terms of the documentation, like I said, is anything that shows that you have been living together for 1 year. Okay, are there any other questions? Or are we pretty much caught up on all of them?
Yeah, we are caught up so far. We can continue.
Thank you. All right, so in terms of I was talking about the agri-food pilot. So it's for usually persons that are in the food production industry, and they have a specific list of persons that would be qualifying under that. We have caregiver programs. Now, the caregiver program is also a hybrid program where, you know, persons could apply for permanent residence and work permits at the same time. And the good thing about this program is that it's LMIA exempt, which means that you would need a job offer, but you don't need an LMIA. So you need a job offer from an employer. So the employer has to formally offer you a job, and they have to submit that job offer on the IRCC's website. So they have to create a portal and they have to submit that job. But there's no LMIA, but you have to be meeting the permanent residence and the work permit requirements in order to come under this program. So you're looking at caring for children, or you're looking at caring for persons with high medical needs. And ultimately, the family that you're caring for would be the employer, right? So the family that you're caring for are the ones that are going to employ you, and they're going to give the supporting documents to show that they can pay your salary and they could cover your working in Canada. And they could also vouch for the different types of duties that you're going to be doing. So under this program, you need to have education, you need to do your language test, and you get a work permit first. I think your spouses and your children are able to come to Canada and get their work permit at the same time and get their study permits and so on. And you work for 2 years, and after the 2 years is finished, then you're able to apply for your permanent residence. So the caregiver program is a really good program as well for persons that are in that field. The only drawback about that program is that it's open once a year and it is capped. So they have a certain amount of applications that they process, and the program usually closes really quickly. So it usually opens every January, and within a couple of weeks, like it's closed, right? So if you're looking at coming under that program, you're looking at preparing your documentation way ahead so that you could get it submitted as soon as the program opens, and you're able to get that work permit and then eventually that PR. Now we have The Quebec skilled workers and the Quebec business programs, which are separate, those go through Quebec. So anything for Canadian immigration, Quebec is separate. Quebec is the French part of Canada, and they have their own immigration rules. So when you're looking at coming, if you're interested in, like, for example, living in Montreal or living anywhere in Quebec, you want to apply to Quebec directly because they have their own immigration. They have their website, their own immigration website. So you want to apply to Quebec. You want to get the approval from Quebec, and then you want to take that approval and apply to the federal government for your work permit or for your permanent residence. So the Quebec Skilled Workers Program is really good. The Quebec business programs are really good as well. And I think that the programs are a lot easier, but there is that French requirement. So most of the time, you know, like the programs would require you to have some kind of understanding of French. Sometimes not basic, they want intermediate and advanced, but sometimes you could find some programs that for basic French, but the Quebec programs are really flexible. Now we also have, the, as I said, the pilot program. So the Rural Northern Immigration Pilot and the Atlantic Immigration Pilot Program. So if we're wondering as to what regions and what areas, in terms of the rural, we have North Bay, we have Sudbury, we have Thunder Bay, and there are a lot more. And then for the Atlantic provinces, as I said, you have Newfoundland and Labrador, you have Prince Edward Island, you have Nova Scotia, and then you have New Brunswick. So if you're not aware, you never heard of these provinces, you could definitely look it up because Canada is big and broad, and there are just so many different provinces and so many different places that you could migrate to.
Shanta, before you go on, there's another question which relates to the Atlantic Immigration Program, and if you have specific sites for that.
The Atlantic Immigration Program, it will be on the main government site. So that is going to be on www.canada.ca. And all the information that you need for that program is going to be on the Canada site. Okay. You could access the Canada immigration site, which will have information, and then they may have hyperlinks that would take you to the separate provinces. So for the Atlantic program, you want to look at the federal government site, and then you also want to look at the particular province that you're going to. So for example, if you're looking at Prince Edward Island, you would go to the government's website, which would have the information about the Atlantic immigration program itself. And then you would go to Prince Edward Island's their site to probably see the list of endorsed employers. So the employers are provided by a list, and the lists are usually on the provincial websites. Now, the next category in terms of obtaining legitimate status in Canada would be applying under family sponsorship categories, which is what we call family class, like when you have family members in Canada. Now, the thing is that persons with family members in Canada can be sponsored. Sometimes they can be sponsored for permanent residence, but not all family members are eligible to be sponsored. So for immigration, our sponsorship category is called our family class category. And we have a saying that all your family members are your family members, but not all family members are part of the family class. So it means that just any and every family member can't sponsor you to come to Canada. So these family members that you can sponsor, and when we're talking about sponsorship, we're talking about only a Canadian citizen or permanent resident can sponsor their family members. It's not possible for a temporary resident, so somebody that's here as a visitor or student or worker, to sponsor their family members because they're not a permanent resident, they're not a Canadian citizen. So the first thing to know about sponsorship is that you would have a Canadian or permanent resident in Canada, and then they're looking to sponsor their family members. The family members that those Canadians and permanent residents can sponsor would be their spouses, so persons that they're married to, their common law partners, so persons that they have been living with for at least 12 months, their conjugal partners, which are partners when marriage and living together common law is not possible, right? It's not possible because of some kind of immigration barrier or because some kind of systemic barrier that causes persons not to be able to live together or get married. So for example, in some places, it's not possible for same-sex persons to be married or live together. So that would be a conjugal partner type situation, right? So in Canada, we recognize spouses, which people are married, common law partners living together for at least 12 months, and conjugal partners. Now, the thing about spouses, common law partners, and conjugal partners, regardless of whatever you're applying for immigration, if you're bringing your spouse, common law partner, or conjugal partner, you need to make sure that you need to make sure that you're proving your status. So if you're a spouse, you need to have your marriage certificate. You need to show that you're married. If you're common law, you need to show that you've been living together for 12 months. And if you're a conjugal partner, it means that you would have to show that you're in a relationship. Now, the underpinning to sponsor under these categories is that these applications are based on being in a genuine relationship, as you would describe it. So it means a relationship that is underpinned by financial independencies, emotional dependencies. They're intertwined in that way. We're talking about romantic type relationships. Now, the other category of persons that you could sponsor would be your dependent children, which would be under the age of 22, who are unmarried or who are unmarried and they're not in a common law relationship. So if your children are under the age of 22 but they're married and they're in a common law relationship, then you're not able to sponsor them. But if they're under the age of 22 and they're married and they're not, if they're under the age of 22 and they're unmarried, they're not in a common law relationship, you could go ahead and sponsor them. And then also if they're over the age of 22 and they have been dependent on their parents due to a mental or physical condition. So, and we're talking about the Canadian and permanent resident, that is the parent. Now with dependent children, you could sponsor your own dependent children, and you could also sponsor your spouses or your common law partner's dependent children. So if you're sponsoring your spouse or your common law partner and they have children that are under the age of 22 or fit this particular prescribed situation, you can sponsor them as well. And you could also sponsor your children, your dependent children you could also sponsor your grandchildren in that circumstance. So if you have dependent children that also have dependent children, so for example, if you have like a 19-year-old that has a child of their own, you could sponsor both your child and your grandchild, but you would have to make sure that you're proving that they're not married and they're not in a common law relationship. Now, the next category of persons that you could sponsor are your parents and grandparents. So for Canadians and permanent residents, they could sponsor their parents and grandparents. The parents and grandparents sponsorship is a really hot sponsorship in Canada. Usually they open it once a year, so you can't sponsor your parents and grandparents all year long. There's a prescribed time in the year that you could sponsor your parents and grandparents, and there is a financial criteria, so it goes by your income. So for your spouses, common law partners, and dependent children, there's no financial criteria in that there's no income requirement but for your parents and grandparents, it depends on your income. So individuals usually have to be working and they have to show income for 3 years directly before they sponsor their parents and grandparents. And the parents and grandparents, their sponsorship is really, really, really popular, as I said. You could also sponsor your brothers, sisters, nephews, nieces, or grandchildren who are under the age of 18, but orphaned, okay? So you get a lot of questions about if persons could sponsor their brothers, sisters, cousins. Usually no, they would have to be orphaned and they would have to be under the age of 18. And there is a category in Canadian immigration that you could sponsor any relative that you desire, but you would have to show, as the person that is in Canada, as the permanent resident or the Canadian citizen, you would have to show that you are lonely. So you fit that lone Canadian category. So it means that you have no other living relatives that you can sponsor. So you have no spouses, no common law partners, no conjugal partners, you have no dependent children, no parents. You would have to show that you're in Canada alone and there's no living relatives that you could sponsor. In that type situation, the government allows you to sponsor any family member you choose. So you could sponsor a cousin, you could sponsor aunt, you could sponsor uncle, you could sponsor anyone that you choose. But you would have to show again that you're alone and there's no living relatives that you could sponsor. Now, with the sponsorship categories, they come with financial criterias, and they come with what we call undertaking. So like I said, for spouses and common law partners, conjugal partners, and dependent children, you don't have to show a specific income. Even if, a person is not working or they're in school, they could still sponsor their spouses, they could still sponsor their children. But there is what we call an undertaking in Canadian immigration, which means that you're financially responsible for these persons for a specified period of time. So your spouses, common law partners, conjugal partners, and dependent children, you're usually responsible for them. For spouses, common law partners, and conjugal partners, you're responsible for them for 3 years in terms of being financially responsible. And for dependent children, you're responsible for them for 10 years or until they reach the age of 25, sometimes whichever comes sooner. And for parents and grandparents, you're responsible for them financially for 20 years. Okay, brothers, sisters, nephews, nieces, and grandchildren, it depends on their ages, is usually 10 years or until they reach 25. And for other relatives, it's usually 3 years. So the thing about being financially responsible, it doesn't mean that you have to physically give persons money. It doesn't mean that the Canadians or permanent residents have to physically give these individuals money. It just means that you're committing to look after them. And if they happen to go on welfare, which is government social services, if they go on government welfare for the duration of the time that your undertaking exists, then it would mean that you would have to pay that money back to the government. So again, I'm speaking to the Canadians and permanent residents with respect to sponsoring. So it's okay to sponsor your family members, but if you have an undertaking of 3 years or say 20 years, and within that period, your family members take money from the government, so they take different types of social benefits from the government, the individuals are required to pay that money back to the government before they could sponsor anybody else. Now, in terms of applying, so we're done with family. The next category is refugee, the refugee program. So the refugee program has been really popular, and I know that there have been a lot of talk about the refugee program. And I just wanted to say that in terms of refugee, it could be a very complex program that comes with very serious ramifications and very serious responsibilities. So persons could apply for refugee. And the idea of applying for refugee is that you're applying for what we call protected person status in Canada. So you're asking the Canadian government to give you protection because you're saying that your country of origin is incapable of protecting you, right? So I would say that making a refugee claim in Canada is like not necessarily a full launch, but is basically telling the government that you've been persecuted, or you had a threat to your life, or you're going to lose your life, and your country doesn't have the resources or is just incapable of protecting you because they're facilitating whatever harm you face. So we have two main streams to apply for refugee. We have the refugee determination system in Canada, which is really popular, is when you're claiming asylum in Canada, when we say inside Canada, or we have the refugee and humanitarian resettlement program outside Canada. Now, in terms of the refugee determination system in Canada, if you're making a claim inside Canada, you have to make your way to Canada. So you're either making your claim at the port of entry when you're coming into Canada, or you're making your claim when you're inside Canada, right? So in terms of people making a refugee claim, ultimately, if you have the grounds to make a refugee claim, the valid grounds, the legitimate grounds to make a refugee claim, you can make a refugee claim. But if you're looking at coming under the refugee and humanitarian resettlement program outside Canada, you need a referral from the UN. So you need a referral from the UNHCR, or you would need a referral from a designated organization that deals with refugees outside Canada, okay? And if you're coming into Canada, as I said, you would have to make your refugee claim at the port of entry, or you make your refugee claim inside Canada. Now, the thing about making refugee is not another category that you could just apply. So it's not any of the other categories that we talked about. It's not like family, it's not like economic, it's not based on your education. The main crux of making a refugee claim in Canada is claiming that you have been persecuted or that you are at risk of torture, cruel and unusual treatment in your home country. Now, the thing about this is that they ask you to prove it. So for refugee claims inside Canada, there's a formal court process, a formal hearing process that goes on where you actually have to go and you have to give your testimony as to your experiences and your persecution or your unusual treatment or punishment under oath. Okay, and you're actually attesting that, whatever you're saying is true, that you have been, beat up, you have been abused, and the other part of making a claim is that the country's resources, like the persons that would usually be protecting you, like the police forces and the courts, are incapable or unable to protect you, or that they're facilitating and they're compliant in your persecution. Okay, so making a claim against your home country is, like I said, attesting under oath that your country is unable and they're unwilling to provide you with that protection. And therefore, Canada steps in and says, well, we're going to protect you. We're going to offer you that protection. Now, the thing about making a refugee claim is that you're automatically given a deportation order when you make your claim. So making a claim is so serious that is expected that once they hear you, if you won your case, it means that they believe you, they're going to offer you protection. And if you lose your case, it's basically saying they don't believe you and you should leave Canada. So this is why you're given a conditional deportation order when you make your claim, and your travel documents, like your passports, are automatically seized. So they seize your passports because it's kind of like you're renouncing your country of origin, right? Like you're saying that you know there's no need for you to have that citizenship or to have access to that country because you're persecuted there and you're basically tortured there. So they seize your passports, and ultimately, if you win your claim, you should be able to travel other places, but not to that country. Like traveling back to your home country would be seen as though you're what we call reavailing yourself, means that you're putting yourself at risk to the same persecution and the same treatment or unusual punishment that you claim under. So it's a very serious, type immigration pathway that is usually seen as a last resort. So for persons that are making a claim and they're, kind of truly being persecuted, like for example, persons from war-torn countries where, they're getting bombs dropped on them, etc. It's kind of understandable they don't want to go back there. They fled for their life. They could prove it. For persons that are making claims on an individual basis, if you're saying that you were attacked, if you're saying that you were victimized by family members, by gangs, whatever, you definitely have to prove that you definitely have to prove that what you say is true. And like I said, you're given that conditional deportation order once you made that claim. Now, refugee claimants are unable to return to their home country even after their claims are accepted, and even if they have gained protected person status. So the idea is that you shouldn't be returning, right? So refugee claimants shouldn't be returning in the sense that our refugee program in Canada, the refugee program and the immigration program is parallel. Like they're not the same, they're parallel. So when you're making a refugee claim, it's not like if you're using it to get permanent residence in Canada or get citizenship. When you make a refugee claim, the most important part of your case is that you're seeking protection, and you have that protected person status that travels with you throughout the immigration system. So it means that even if you're allowed to apply for permanent residence and you're allowed to later apply for citizenship, you will always be seen in the system as a protected person. So it would mean that anytime you go back to your home country or anytime you travel back, you run the risk of the Canadian authorities questioning why you're going back there, right? And recently we have had an increase in persons that have been getting their protected person status reversed because they're going back to their home countries. Even something as simple as, they're seizing your passport and then you're looking to get a new passport after the process from your home country is seen as reavailing yourself. So if they find out that you apply for a passport from your country, even though they seized your passport before, you run the risk of them basically revoking that protection. So it's really important that people know that refugee is not something that is permanent. If the authorities become aware of a person that is fraudulently using the refugee process, by way of lying or misrepresenting certain facts in their claim, and the authorities find this out, they definitely would revoke that person's protection status. And what makes it worse is that if a person is coming from a visa exempt country, like for example, Barbados, we don't need a visa to travel to Canada. Refugee persons, an influx of persons from a country making a refugee claim makes the country more visible in a way that, you know, the government, the Canadian government, is more inclined to put that country on the visitor visa list. So right now, Barbados is ETA, but our status is ETA in that we're visa exempt, but that is not like a permanent status. Like, we have been so for many years. I can't even remember a time where we needed a visa to come to Canada. But that status could change in the sense that we could be required to need a TRV if they see that there is an influx of persons making claims in Canada and making fraudulent claims in Canada. So that is one of the ramifications of making refugee claims in Canada. Now, if a person is truly persecuted and they're truly running for their life, I see no problem with them making a refugee claim. But if a person is abusing the system and misrepresenting facts, it could be very serious. Now, if a person's claim is rejected, the removal order that they get in the beginning, it becomes enforceable and they can be deported from Canada. So they lose their status. They kind of like they're deported from Canada. So I'm not saying the process is usually a long process, but at the same time, it's serious enough that if you lose your claim, you get a removal order. If you win your claim, you're able to stay, you're able to get permanent residence, you're able to get Canadian citizenship, not return back home. But if you lose your case, you're ultimately rejected, you're ultimately removed from Canada, and they see in the system that you made a refugee claim. So that would mean that if you then decide to apply to study to come to Canada, or decide to work to come to Canada, or you decide to apply under one of the programs, they're going to see that you made a refugee claim, and that would potentially make it more difficult for you to come to Canada. So it's not a program, you know, to play with, even though it's being popularized as another way. It's just not another program. It's a program that is aside from all the other programs that you would learn about, and it's only for persons that are truly seeking refuge from their home countries. So I think there's a question.
Yeah, there's a question. You mentioned under the refugee claim, you stated a type of documentation is needed from the UN. Is there a cost attached to receive such a document?
So you're talking about the UNHCR referral, or a designated organization. From my knowledge, there's no cost attached. But again, the UN is only going to give the referral to somebody that they think is a refugee, and usually is not a case by case process. So in our refugee system, we do recognize two different types of situations. So we recognize persons that have a generalized fare, and then we recognize persons that have a personalized fare. So if you have a generalized fare, it means that you're coming from a country that's war-torn, where they have different people that have the same circumstances. So for example, an Afghan refugee or somebody coming from Ukraine. If you're coming from some place where you have a personalized fare, it's very difficult to get a UN referral, because they don't recognize case by case situations. Usually you could get a referral from a designated organization, but again, it's really not that easy. So there's some regions where making a refugee claim from outside Canada is very common. The UN is present, and they have a presence there. They're in a refugee camp, right? So you have to be outside of your country of origin. So if you're going to make a refugee claim from outside Canada, you can't be in your country of origin. So one of the requirements for making refugee is that you're outside of your country of origin. You can't be in the place where you're making a claim. You can't be in the place where you're making a claim against and saying that you're not protected. You have to be outside, right? And usually those persons that get the UNHCR referral or designated institutions referral, they're in refugee camps. And for other people that are looking to make a refugee claim based on personalized circumstances, they're making their way to Canada, and they're making their claim at the port of entry, and they're making their claim from inside Canada. Okay. Now, the last category of permanent residence or permanent resident type applications that you could apply for that would give you legitimate status in Canada would be what we will call humanitarian and compassionate considerations applications, which is a miscellaneous type category. So this is a category that is not to be abused, is not refugee, is not economic, is entirely different. So this particular category is for persons that are inside Canada that have exceptional and compelling reasons to remain in Canada. So these individuals are usually not eligible to apply for any residence programs, permanent residence programs, and they're usually, sometimes they're inadmissible to Canada. So it could work for either inadmissible or ineligible. So when we're talking about inadmissible, we're talking about, you know, like in Canada, there's a requirement that every person applying to come to Canada should be generally healthy and they should have no criminality. And sometimes some people have criminality on their record. Sometimes they're, you know, some people have some type of medical issues that would render them inadmissible to Canada. And there's no way for them to apply for permanent resident programs, because when they apply and they do their medical examination, which is mandatory to do, and they run their police checks, these, you know, these problem areas are going to come up and they're not going to be eligible to apply. So this category is a category that allows persons to apply despite their ineligibility and despite their inadmissibility. But in terms of applying for this particular category, it's for individuals, you know, when individuals are seeking for that exemption and they have to prove that they're deserving of this exemption. So the requirement is that you're to fit into one of those permanent resident categories that we discussed before. And if you're not able to fit in those permanent resident categories, then you could explore the option of applying for humanitarian. So it's kind of like a last resort, right? It's truly a last resort. The applications are exceptional, they're discretionary. And in each case, it's, you know, each case is very unique and is decided on its own merits. So it's not like a standard way of applying. Everybody has different circumstances, and the government applies the, you know, the laws to these different cases differently. So it's a very broad spectrum with respect to applying. Okay. Now, in terms of humanitarian and the factors that they're looking for in these type of applications, so they do acknowledge that sometimes the requirements for family class, family sponsorship are really tight. So sometimes individuals might be in Canada accompanying family members that are aunts and uncles, and they're not able to sponsor them, but they have close family ties where the family is dependent on that person, and that person is an integral part of the family unit. By way of financial ties, by way of emotional ties, by way of psychological ties. And therefore, those are arguments that you make. And then they look at the impact of this person being removed from Canada or having to return back to their home country. How does that affect the family members in Canada? They also look at the best interest of the child. So some people are in Canada, they get themselves in sticky situations, they end up overstaying in Canada, being in Canada for many years, and they may have children outside Canada that they're supporting, or they have children inside Canada. In this type of application, they consider the best interest of the children. So the officers are legally obligated to consider the best interest of any children that might be affected inside Canada or outside Canada. And then it's also based on establishment. So persons that are working, that are proving that they're financially stable, they're independent, they have a stable pattern of saving, you know, they're self-sufficient, they're not dependent on the government for any kind of social welfare or social benefits. They're integrating into Canada, so they're well organized into the community, they're known in the community, they volunteer, they have a good civil record, so they don't have any criminality. And then there's a hardship where they would be returning. So when we're talking about hardship, we're not talking about refugee factors, we're talking about hardship in terms of reintegrating back into their home country, or, you know, being abused or not having family support. So we're talking about hardship in a broad way, right? So they're showing that they're better off in Canada and they have a hardship where they would be returning. And so these type applications you submit with these type factors, making these type arguments, backed up with case laws, legal arguments underpinning, and therefore the officer is able to see that, you know, you may not be qualifying under one of the classes and you may not be eligible or admissible to come to Canada, but there are compelling factors to consider that they should grant your permanent residence. So what they do is they grant you an exemption, and then they process your permanent residence. They grant you an exemption for whatever reason you're inadmissible or whatever reason you're ineligible, and then they grant your permanent residence, right? So this category is not refugee, is completely different. You can't put anything to do with fear or persecution or anything like that in these type applications. They're very different, they're very unique, but for persons that are in sticky situations where they cannot apply for anything else. So if you could apply for a study permit, or you could apply for a work permit, or you could apply for express entry or economic, or you could do family sponsorship, they're gonna refuse you because you have other options. one of the main things for these type of applications is that there's no other option, right? And for many people, there are other options. Okay.
Yeah. So Chantal, there are two questions. One asked, what about a child who is studying and a parent wanting to be there during this study period? Is there consideration for a child and parent in this situation? And the other question is inquiring about applying under a religious capacity.
Okay.
So I guess that's taking us back to a little bit earlier.
Okay. So in terms of the first question, with respect to a parent and a child, like if a child is studying in Canada and the parent wants to accompany them, the parent has to, make sure that they're legitimately coming to Canada on their own accord. So they would either need to be here as a visitor, which means that they're here for 6 months at a time, extending their stay, leaving and coming back. They're applying for work permit, they're applying for study permit, or they're applying for permanent residence on their own, right? There's no compassionate or humanitarian type considerations given to parents and children. And if children are minors, parents have to make sure that they're in Canada, they're looked after. So they're either looked after by the institution that they're going to, or they're looked after by some kind of guardian. So for minors, there are a lot of guidelines with respect to minors studying, and minors studying usually can't be unaccompanied. If it's a child that is not a minor, then they're not seen as a child. So as long as the person is generally over 18, they're not seen as a child in Canadian immigration. Dependent child and minors are two different definitions. So dependent child is under the age of 22. A minor is somebody that's under the age of 18. So if your child is studying, they're 19, they're 20, they're seen as an adult. But if you apply for permanent residence and you want to include them in the application, as long as they're under the age of 22, then they're seen as dependent children. I hope that's clear. And what was the second question again? Was with respect to religious capacity?
Yeah, I believe the person was inquiring if they want to apply under, as a minister of religion or something like that. It wasn't very clear.
Okay, that's fine. Ministers and religious workers could work in Canada without a work permit. So those are part of the prescribed persons that could work in Canada without a work permit. They could generally, usually they're not entering into the labor market in that sense. They usually get a stipend from the organization. So if they enter Canada on a visitor visa or an ETA, they could work in Canada, they could get their stipend and they don't need to get a work permit or they don't need to get an LMIA. However, they could get a work permit under the LMIA exemption, but the religious organization that is hiring them would need to submit a formal job offer to the Canadian government. So they would have to submit a formal job offer to the Canadian government stating that they want to hire this person, and then that person could get a work permit for a longer period in time. So they could get a work permit for like 2 years or 3 years. So there is a possibility for that person to work in Canada, either without a work permit or with a work permit. But if they're going for the work permit, they would need to get the cooperation of the religious organization that they're going to be working with. And that is also for charitable organizations as well. So persons that are working for NGOs and other charitable organizations that are doing, cultural and social work in Canada. I hope I was able to answer that person's question and make it clear.
I'll trust, and if you have not, I will just invite them to repost the question. There is a follow-up to the question about the parent who wanted to stay here with their child, but it sounds as if they've gone into well, you'll be the judge. It says she started as a minor, but was given accommodation by her university. She's now 18. I'm not sure if you would want to venture into that one.
Well, she's not a minor. I think I answered it already in the sense that, like there's no accommodations. Like if your child is coming as a student, you would have to come on your own accord. So you're either applying for visitor, you're either coming as a visitor, you're applying for your own work permit, you're coming, as a student as well, or you're applying for permanent residence. There's no considerations if you're applying, you can't, there's no program that allows you to come to Canada just because your child is studying. Everybody's individual, right? So I hope that is a little clearer. Now, in terms of take-home tips,
one more question.
Okay.
It says, is it guaranteed that if you have a child born in Canada, you can get your PR? Would they separate parent and child, or would they send the child back with the parent?
So if a person gets a child in Canada, okay, so no, that's not a guarantee. Just because you get a child in Canada, it doesn't mean that you have the right to be in Canada. If you get a child in Canada, but you have prescribed circumstances, so for example, if you have humanitarian and compassionate factors, like de facto family members, family unit here, establishment in Canada, hardship where you would be going back to, then you could consider exploring the option of applying for humanitarian and using the fact that you have a child as one of your arguments. But you run the risk of the government deporting you and telling you that the child is going to be Canadian anyway. So sometimes some officers say, well, you leave Canada and then the child could come back when they're 18. And some officers would be more lenient and would approve your application. So having a child in Canada doesn't mean that you're going to get your paperwork. It just means that you have a child that was born in Canada. Sorry to say.
I think that's all the questions that we've received either individually or on the general forum.
Okay, thank you. All right, so take home tips. So I think what we could gather from this presentation is that, if you're going to come to Canada, you try to get under one of the economic categories unless you have a family member that could sponsor you. And, like in terms of coming to Canada temporarily, studying is always a great option. Working is good as long as everything is in place for you to work. You want to make sure that you're validating your information about migrating to Canada. You want to make sure that, if you're looking to study and work, you're making sure that your decisions are in line with getting permanent residence if you're interested. You want to make sure that you're using the right sites. You want to make sure that you're wary of any types of posts or any types of forwarded messages that you would get talking about coming to Canada that would make it seem extremely easy. Tomorrow is going to be really interesting because we're going to be debunking certain myths and scams around Canadian immigration. And I think that goes with the other side of what we discussed today. Anytime you see anyone talking about Canadian immigration and is so simple and is so like effortless, is probably a scam, right? Like they have their standards, they have their requirements, it's a process. Generally, if you're looking to move to Canada permanently, it takes, up to a year, 6 months to a year. And generally, if you're looking to come to Canada temporarily, to study, it could be really quickly, but you're looking at doing a full process, right? So nothing is like flowers and rainbows and unicorns. It takes a lot of work and dedication in terms of getting to Canada. And anytime you're seeing, persons ask you for funds without looking at your documentation or without, really asking you questions about your age and your eligibility, and if you did the language test and so on, you're looking at making sure you're looking at those companies a little bit deeper. You're looking at if the persons are that you're talking to, if they're licensed. You want to make sure that you're not paying them any money, you're not giving them your financial information, because they shouldn't be charging you to work in Canada. Even to look for schools, I don't think they should be charging you to look for schools, right? So if someone is charging you to do your work permit process or to do the study permit process, and they're a lawyer, they're a consultant, then that is okay. But if somebody's doing the grassroots steps, and they're charging you money or they're making exuberant promises to you, more than likely is not legit and it will not end well. So those are the take-home tips. If there are any questions, I'll be happy to take them.
I have a general question for the list of official sites that they can use. I know you've indicated the Canada.org site numbers, but if there are any others you would wish to share with them before you go, I think that would be good.
Yeah, for job searching or just for information? So for information is going to be the Canada's website, which is w.ca. Like that is the best. In terms of job searching, like I have the links and the sites within this presentation. So this presentation is going to be made available. I think Council So
Yes, we normally put it on our it'll be on YouTube, as the previous presentations we've done are all on YouTube.
yeah,
So you can, and that should be probably up by tomorrow, I would say, if
yeah.
not later tonight. Yeah.
Perfect.
Oh,
Yeah.
Friday, sorry. It will be up, both parts will be up by Friday. Sorry,
Okay.
forgive me.
Okay.
Perfect. Yeah. So that answers that question. And then in terms of anything else with respect to immigration, like everything I've been talking about, it would be on the government's website, www.canada.ca. It may be a little difficult to navigate because there's a lot of information, but you should take the time, read the information, and everything is there. Anything else that is in blogs or articles and stuff, you want to cross-reference, you want to make sure that it's coming directly from the government. Okay. Well, thank you, everyone.
Well, thank you very much, Chantel. And just let me remind participants that you can use the same Zoom link, same link for tomorrow's presentation, begins at 6. As you say, the name of that presentation tomorrow is entitled "Debunking Myths and Scams Around Canadian Immigration." Sounds like a very interesting and important topic. Just want to also let participants know of 2 upcoming events on Wednesday the 26th. So that is next Wednesday, 26th at 6 a.m. We're having a panel discussion, and that is entitled "Barbadian Professionals in Canada: Opportunities, Options, and Observations." And in this panel discussion, we will be exploring some of the opportunities and some of the challenges that Barbadian professionals, especially young professionals, or even prospective professionals, may confront as they pursue their professional careers in Canada. So that seems like it fits nicely, having migrated to Canada and you've studied, you've gotten your status and so on. You want now to pursue your professional career. So the question is, what are some of the challenges that you may confront? What are the opportunities? How do you effectively navigate your professional career in Canada? So that panel discussion next Wednesday promises to be very interesting. And we invite you to visit our Barbados Consulate's Facebook page for more information on that event. So Chantel, thank you very much. I want to thank my colleague from the Barbados High Commission, Mr. Andre Padmore, and all the my colleagues who assisted in making tonight's presentation really interesting, informative, and very, very useful. Once again, Chantel, thank you very much for making yourself available, and see you tomorrow at 6 p.m. for part 2 of this presentation.
Thank you. And for those that are wondering, like I can be reached, like my website handle is here on the screen, and I have my number and my email up. So for those that are wanting to speak to me personally, then they could always reach out.
Okay, thank you, and good night to everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Good night.